Boom, what up? Today we're going to talk about the same thing that we talked about last time, which is sandbox practice for raiding in World of Warcraft. So, what's the state of the world? I posted a comment on the competitive subreddit outlining my claim that more guilds should try and rehearse boss fights in like sandboxed, low stakes environments, like going into heroic raid and sort of walking the boss around in the same way that you would on Mythic, but not really trying too hard to kill the boss, just like practicing what the movements will look like in Mythic or something like that. Or, massively overhealing at the start of the fight, ignoring your rotation, and just like walking around doing all the Mythic mechanics at the start of the fight, focusing solely on getting those correct. This comment was received pretty negatively for a couple reasons. First is that I argue a lot with people over there in hostile ways, and so I think I don't have a lot of cachet with them. But also I think it was a less refined version of the idea, and I think I've since maybe made a little more clear my beliefs about the topic, and so I'd like to restate those in a new sort of central claim that I'd like people to contest with, at least in theory. I don't think anyone actually will, but the thing I wish that people would contest with. And then we'll go through some of the common responses and why I think that they're not really sufficient. And to explain the title of this video, I think one takeaway I've had from this discussion is that even though I'm not sure I'm correct, like I have a belief, I'd like to test that belief, but I'm not confident it's correct. I'm very confident that the people replying to me are not correct, because I think they've mostly made bad arguments, and I'm mostly sad that they've made things that seem like pretty first order wrong, and we haven't gotten to more interesting discussions. So cool. What's the restated version of the thesis? I think you can look down here to see it, or up here. The main idea is that a lot of human activities look kind of like raiding in World of Warcraft. And to the extent that they are comparable to raiding, but have different methods of practicing and skill acquisition and preparation, we should be able to account for those differences. What does that mean? Well, you could think of something like American football. So in American football, you have like 11 dudes who line up and do this really scripted movement every 30 seconds or something. That's kind of like a raid encounter, where like a lot of people have specific jobs, they have to be in specific places at specific times, and everything is really this coordinated group movement, and if people get it wrong, everything falls apart and you fail. Now you could say American football looks kind of like raiding in that respect. Maybe they do practice differently. Maybe they learn plays in their playbook slightly differently than we do. Maybe they do things really differently. And if raiders are learning raid bosses very differently from how football players learn plays, we should be able to point to something that is different between the two activities to explain that difference in behavior. If we look at them and we say, like, actually these activities are really, really comparable, but people are practicing them in totally different ways, then we kind of have this weird discrepancy. We're like, you're kind of doing the two similar things, but going about them in very different ways, and we should try and unify them, or like take some lessons from each other. Now, good response to that might be that, like, hey, American football is actually not that similar. Like, the plays only last for 10 seconds or so. You have a smaller roster. You're going against an opponent who's like actively trying to break up your plans. So it's like this adversarial thing where there's a lot more sort of mind games and sort of strategy involved. Like, it's not a scripted raid boss that's never going to change their behavior. It's a human opponent who's like constantly evolving their strategy. So a lot of the things that they're working on aren't going to transfer over to a more static environment like raiding. But you could look at a couple other activities, like maybe musical groups who are practicing like a dance routine for a song. That kind of looks like a raid. Like, we call movement in dance, or we call movement in raid dances, and so maybe we should think that dancing is kind of relevant. Like, you have a group of maybe 5 to 10 dancers or something that are doing something for 4 to 8 minutes. That kind of sounds like a raid boss. You have this like very, very scripted movement that's never really going to change, but you might have to account for slight variations as how your dance partners are executing their moves. Like, I don't know. It's maybe not exactly the same. There's not as much fine motor control. It's more like gross movement ability. Maybe you could say there's less variance because you're not like randomly going to get targeted by a mechanic when you're dancing, but I don't know. Maybe we should look at like how dancers practice and see if they're doing something very differently from raiders. And I've listed a couple other ones. I think some of these are worse than others. Like, you'd say like the 4x100 medley relay in swimming. Well, it's a group activity for like 4 to 6 minutes or something, but clearly it's more about like physical power output and individual performance. There's not a lot of like codependence on what your partners are doing. It's mostly like 4 individual legs swam one after the other. And so you could say like, hey, this actually looks nothing like rating. So we don't need to transfer over all the things that they're doing. Like when swimmers spend 20 hours a week practicing to get fitter and not actually like practicing their movements as much, maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we need to focus more on things that look more like World of Warcraft, like maybe gymnastics, where you're like doing really coordinated movements and practicing routine. Maybe that looks more like rating. And so we should take more of the lessons from gymnastics than we take from swimming or something like that. Anyway, this is the thing I would like people to try and defease is like, why does World of Warcraft rating preparation not look as much like the preparation for dancing or gymnastics or musical performers learning a new piece of music, things like that? So what are the common responses I got to this thesis? Well, number one is that it's just a waste of time, and people really underspecified this. They just said like, this won't work and will waste time, but it's not clear why it's going to waste time. Like clearly when people reply this, they have something behind this argument in mind where they're thinking like, it's going to waste time because the skills won't transfer over, or because the pace of Mythic is so much different from Heroic or something like that. And to the extent that we have underlying motivations for these arguments, we should like investigate those rather than just like stating the conclusion of the argument, which is just kind of boring. You just say like, no, you're wrong, lol, and sign off. Like that's not very interesting. Another really common one is that it's hard to do DPS and mechanics at the same time, so we should practice them at the same time. And mostly, I think these people like miss the point of the argument, which is that I agree with them. It's hard to do damage and mechanics at the same time. Like that's the central challenge of rating. And so we should make that easier to learn. I'm saying that like a way to learn a skill that is difficult is to break it into easier subcomponents and practice those subcomponents before reintegrating them into one whole demonstration of the skill. And I feel like when people say that it's hard to do these at the same time, they're mostly just arguing that like you should always practice the hardest version of a skill possible that you're like eventually going to do, as opposed to like ever splitting it into smaller subcomponents. And I don't know, maybe there's like actual literature on skill acquisition that supports this, but it kind of runs afoul to how we practice music or how we practice dancing or anything else, where it's like you're getting to some really challenging endpoint by building up the blocks little by little. And then another thing that people latch onto, which is mostly with regard to the suggestion about overhealing, is that it's going to require you to relearn the fight really significantly. Like if you have 6 healers in at the start of a fight, when you ramp down to 5 and when you ramp down to 4, those healers are going to have to relearn all their cooldown timings and the dangerous parts of the fight. And I think this is true. People will have to relearn some things, but my main claim is that relearning is always happening all the time during progression. When you start out a fight, you are sending more cooldowns with your 4 healers than you are going to at the end of progression. You're probably sending a Bloodlust early. You're probably sending potions early. People are taking much more avoidable damage. So the like damage intake and healing throughput that your raid is experiencing are both wildly different at the start of progression than they're going to be in 100 or 200 pulls. So your healers are already relearning all those things throughout progression, and it mostly goes smoothly. My claim here is that it's easier to relearn healing cooldowns or like specific danger points in the fight when you are confident in the footwork and mechanics that are happening simultaneously. And I liken this a lot to playing an alt in farm. If you've had the experience of playing one class in progression and then another class on farm, you'll notice that it's really, really easy to relearn all the timings and specific overlaps when you're on the alt. Part of that is because the rest of the raid is better, but also you just have a lot more confidence in what's going to happen when you're playing your alt. If I know exactly where I need to stand at every point on Fyrakk on an arms warrior, and then I swap over to a survival hunter, all I need to relearn is like, okay, survival has 2-minute cooldowns versus minute 30 on arms or something. Okay, I just like mentally reshuffle all the timings, but I know exactly what's going to happen. I'm never going to get surprised by anything in the fight. Much in the same way, if we're prepared for all the movement on our progression healers, even though we're overhealing the fight, it'll be very easy to relearn those timings going down to our progression number of healers, because no one is going to be suddenly shocked by movements that they're unfamiliar with. So to that extent, I think relearning the fight is an overstated point because people are already constantly relearning it. Like your first pulls of progression look nothing like your final pulls. And I think that being more confident in what's going to happen will make it easier to relearn the fight later. So let's see some replies. This is mostly the same thing. You're wasting time relearning things. And then another point is that it's very boring to do dry runs and you're not learning very much. So these are 2 points. Second one, I think we sort of talked about, like, because a lot of the challenge is doing these things simultaneously, I think you should try and split them out. And I would like people who believe that you shouldn't split them out to come up with an argument why it's good for piano players to practice their hands separately, or why it's good for dancers to like learn different parts of a movement before doing the whole thing from start to finish. Why does this approach work in World of Warcraft, but not in all these other similar activities with sort of coordinated motor skills? If we're going to be cynical, I think this point about it being very boring is really a thing that underlies a lot of people's aversion to doing this. People in video games are very scared of deliberate, boring practice. If you tell someone in League of Legends, hey, you should go into the practice tool and practice these combos or practice farming minions or something like this, and you should do this for an hour alone every day until you get really good at it, they're going to say, that's fucking boring, I want to play the game. If you tell people in World of Warcraft that, like, you should practice doing this thing on your spec, or, like, get really comfortable with these mechanics, or, like, think about how to progress a raid boss instead of actually pulling the boss, they will get upset because they are here to play the game and they're not here to get better. If you tell people in fighting games that they need to go into the lab and practice chains of combos and practice wake-ups and practice footsies and all their movement, practice Korean backdashing or things like that until they're really, really good at it in a sandbox environment, they're going to get upset because they just like want to queue into ranked and like beat up on some people. And that's fine, but we have to understand what we're saying when we say these things. If your claim is like, I don't want to do this thing that will make me a more effective practitioner because it's boring, then like you've kind of shut yourself off from ever complaining about other people who make these same claims. If someone in your guild says like, I don't want to enchant my gear because that's expensive and boring and I don't want to farm the gold, you have no leg to stand on them for them being like non-competitive when you're already refusing to do things that will make you a more competitive practitioner. We have to decide at some point, like, what is the threshold past which we're not willing to tolerate boredom or challenge for the sake of improvement? And at that point, like, that's our level of casualness. If we're going to claim to be competitive players or competitive practitioners of something, then we should not turn down interventions that will make us better at this thing solely because they're uninteresting or boring. Like, that's kind of part of being an adult and working and like being good at doing things, is that you recognize when you're doing uninteresting work that will make you better at something. Like, it's not fun to go, run or ride a bicycle or, lift weights or something for the sole sake of getting healthier. But we do those things because it helps us live past 65 or something. Like, it's not fun to do your taxes, but that's part of like maintaining civil order and living in a structured society. Like, you have to do some things that you don't want to do for the sake of the outcomes. And it's not really an interesting argument otherwise. It's just like, this thing is boring to me, I don't want to do it. Similarly, I think some people have some takes that are just don't resonate with me at all. This person says that our hunter changing from marksmanship to beast mastery was a huge change for him. And I don't know. I don't know what people are experiencing. I would love to experience their qualia when they say this because it's just totally foreign to me. It's not that hard to change specs because all of your utility is the same, all of your movement is the same, your defensives are largely the same, and beast mastery is way easier than marksmanship because you can just run around while casting. That should be a very, very trivial transition, and maybe we're just talking about totally different guild levels or like skill levels within the game, because I think changing specs from like one range to another range on the same class should not really be a large adjustment. Maybe if you're going from like outlaw to subtlety, and subtlety has all these like really crazy cooldown timing and cooldown reduction stuff that you have to learn, like that could be a big adjustment. But when you're going from the harder spec to the much easier spec, it's not that difficult to adjust, and I don't know why that would be a major hurdle for this guy. What else do we see? This is another complaint where people sort of miss the forest for the trees of saying like, this intervention won't make progression flawless, so we shouldn't do it at all. And I don't think I ever made that claim. This guy is saying like, okay, when you practice this thing in rehearsal and then go back to doing it at full speed, you're still going to end up wiping because of people relearning things. Yes, I agree. I wish that we had a magic bullet that would make us kill bosses in 5 pulls and be world first. Unfortunately, this shit is challenging and we're going to have to like fail in order to get better. The question is, are there strategies that we can employ that will reduce that amount of friction and the amount of wiping that we have to do in this process? Like, you're going to wipe and struggle relearning things as you reintegrate all these different pieces you practice separately, but maybe that's more efficient than trying to practice them all at the same time. Like, if I want to try and balance a plate in each hand and onto my head, is it easier for me to try and balance all of them at the same time and then keep dropping them over and over? Or should I balance one on my left hand for a while and get good at that, and then balance one on my right hand for a while and get good at that, and then try doing both hands at the same time? Like, this is the claim I'm making. We should probably not just like try to do the entire thing at full speed over and over again and sort of like ram our heads into the wall until we get it perfect one time. Some people also point out that like 5-rack P1 is really easy, and it's extremely easy to do the boss without dying if you don't have to do your rotation and just focus on dodging and staying alive. Again, this is one where maybe my personal experience just doesn't line up with that very closely. If you go into 5-rack on Mythic pre-nerf with no prior knowledge of the fight, or like only having seen kill videos from Liquid and Echo or whatever, you're gonna die even if your sole focus is staying alive and doing mechanics properly. Like, people will place the Dream Rend incorrectly. They'll misjudge how much it's going to pull them. They're going to dodge blaze lines incorrectly. They're going to not account for one frontal or something like that. They're going to miscount their orbs. Like, all these things happen in farm when people are really comfortable with the boss. Like, people still make these blatant mistakes on classes that they're very comfortable with in a boss that they've pulled 500 times. Why do you think it's not going to happen when someone's pulling a boss for the very first time? Like, is your rotation that much added complexity that it's just completely stun locking you and you're unable to do these mechanics properly? I don't know. I think a lot of classes have relatively simple rotations. Some are much more challenging than others, but like, if you play a simple class, there's not that much more going on than doing the mechanics properly and like hitting a pretty scripted sequence of buttons. So why would someone ever screw up 500 pulls into farm? The fact that they still screw these mechanics up on farm is evidence that they would screw these up the very first time you pull a boss, even though you're making it as easy for them as possible. It's just kind of odd that it feels like at some points people claim that like this shit is way harder than it actually seems, and some points they claim that like it's extremely easy to do the fight flawlessly, even though you've never seen the mechanics before and you've no experience practicing them. And I said as much, like, in our Hall of Fame progression, now we were kind of late Hall of Fame, like World 150 or something, but we were still Hall of Fame. A lot of our mistakes were not happening when people were doing damage at the same time as mechanics. They were like people going to the wrong spot in the intermission where the only thing you have to do is identify where you're going and line up. They were people forgetting to grip an ad, where they have like one job and there's not that much else going on. They were people blowing up the very first seeds in P1 with a blaze, even though there's like actually no damage going out and it's the very first set of mechanics on the fight. These were not like we're absolutely cranking every ounce of throughput we have and like there's 15 different mechanics going on while you're doing all this damage. It's really crazy. It's like, no, these were like relatively calm points in the fight where people screwed up basic mechanics because they're hard and they hadn't seen them before. You know, people misjudging where to take the shadow cages or the explosions that break the shadow cages. There's not much happening at the point when those come out. There's like no ads out yet. There's no blazes. You just finished the firestorm. There's nothing to dodge, and people still get this mechanic wrong. Why? It's not because doing your rotation is that hard. It's because the mechanic is hard. And so we should practice the mechanic. This is the same point again. You're wasting time by doing this. Why? Nobody knows. It's not elaborated. Difficulty comes from doing mechanics while doing damage. I don't know. Probably not. And then there's also this cognitive dissonance where people see the value of doing this for the 5-rack knocks or like the grip ad setup in P2, and they don't think that like, hey, this is like a complicated, tricky thing that we screwed up, and so it's good to practice in P2 and Heroic. But maybe we should practice P3 and Heroic because it's also a tricky thing that we screwed up. Like, it's maybe some ego that like, oh, this mechanic is easy, we shouldn't get it wrong. But clearly, lots of people get P3 Firac positioning wrong because you have people standing on the wrong side of the boss and blazing seeds. So, like, what are we doing? Maybe we should try and practice things a little bit before we go do them in the progression setting. And you get a lot more of this, like, no, you're wrong, but it's not clear why. Like, why is the WoW Guild not comparable to a sports team or a musician? I'd like to see the argument. We should try and think about why these things are different instead of just, like, blindly saying that trying something new is going to be wrong. So what are some points that I thought were actually relatively good as counter-arguments? This, I think, misses the theoretical, but is a really valid point, which is that the social aspect of getting this right is basically impossible for reasons outlined prior, where like people in WoW just want to play the game. They don't want to actually get better or think about things that they could be doing differently to improve their performance. So suggesting that they do something that's not fun for the sake of getting better is going to be met pretty harshly. This guy also says that this sort of sandbox rehearsal won't work at very high levels, which I think is maybe less clear to me. Like maybe it stops working for Liquid and Echo because they have really, like, the process of doing damage and mechanics simultaneously is very different from them versus the average Hall of Fame guild. But I don't think that's like immediately obvious. There's no necessary reason why that should be true. And if you watch guilds like Echo, this guy points out they were wearing cheat death trinkets and limit testing with like very what do you call it? They were wearing cheat death trinkets on Tindral and sometimes just practicing mechanics without really trying to progress the boss. Like maybe more than anyone else, these guilds understand that it's very hard to figure out what to do on a boss, and most of the players are very competent at doing the rotation once they know what to do and where to stand. So the challenge is figuring out what to do, and they should try and make that as easy as possible. There's also a good point here where like this guy sort of gets at something that no one else has said, even though maybe they believe it implicitly, is that like the value of rehearsal is proportional to the length of progression on a boss. I think some rehearsal is valuable on Firac because it's like a 30-hour boss for a lot of guilds. And so if you can spend 2 hours rehearsing it and cut that time down to 25 hours, it's like a good trade. But if you're rehearsing Laredar, you're kind of trolling because that was like an hour-long boss. And so maybe you want to do one pull of rehearsal, but for the most part, you just like pull the boss and get it over with. And the final thing that I thought was maybe a good counter-argument is mostly this guy saying rehearsing a raid or doing a dry run where no one's doing the rotation is not really like practicing two hands on a piano. Like you can claim that it is, and I've sort of like put forth that claim, but someone else can sort of equally likely, they like as much grounding to say it's more like miming the notes on a table, and it's so different from the real thing that it's not at all comparable. Now, I don't agree with this counter argument. I think that there's like validity to practicing the movement and having the experience of like moving your character around the arena and like literally seeing all these mechanics come out in practice. I think that's just like useful feedback and learning for a lot of people. But this guy at least like claimed like, no, I think this is like too simplistic. It's like you've sandboxed the environment way too much, and so it's not going to be comparable. And I don't know, I told him like, hey, I think I disagree. Sort of like once I know where I am in the arena and what mechanics are going to happen, slotting in the DPS globals is relatively simple. But at least he like tried to put forth an argument other than just saying that it's clearly wrong for unknown reasons. Anyway, this was a relatively incoherent. Hopefully we've talked a little bit more about this idea, and mostly the central point that we should, as raiders, we should look at things that other people do that look like raiding and try and emulate them to the extent that those strategies are successful. It's kind of crazy to me to think that World of Warcraft raiding has somehow perfected our progression strategies, given that it's a video game that's like 20 years old and doesn't have a lot of financial incentives, whereas like learning difficult pieces of concert music has a lot more financial incentive and a multi-100-year history or something like that. Like, I don't know, maybe you could say that there's some like local minima or something that they get stuck in, and so it's better to disrupt them with this new cultural that isn't stuck to their old ways or something like that. But I don't know. Probably people in musical groups or dance groups have learned something about how to learn new skills and new coordinated movements, and we should try and pick up on some of their lessons.